My wife called me a burden after my accident. I didn't marry to become a caretaker for a crippled husband, she said. I barely had strength to react until a relative she had never met knocked on the door, and she went pale. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. There's a thing marriage doesn't warn you about. You take the oath. You repeat the words in front of the priest, the judge, the family gathered in party clothes and moist eyes, in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow. You repeat it because it's what gets repeated, because it's what the moment asks for, because you're looking at the person you chose, and in that instant you truly believe every syllable. What nobody tells you is that you'll only discover what those words mean to another person the day you truly need them. I found out in a hospital in Makey with a fractured shoulder and the taste of rust in my mouth, hearing my wife's voice on the other end of the phone asking if I was going to lose my job. Not if I was alive, not if I was in pain. I was just a job. That was the moment I understood I'd spent 6 years married to a woman I didn't actually know. And the worst part of this discovery isn't the shock. The worst part is what comes after. When you start looking back and realize the signs were all there visible and you chose not to see because it was more comfortable to believe than to see. We do that. We build a version of the person we love and spend years defending that version against all evidence that contradicts it. You aren't married to the person, you're married to the idea you made of them. And while life is calm, while the money comes in, while no situation appears that demands what you promised at the altar, that idea sustains the whole marriage without needing to be tested. The test arrived when I was least in a condition to fail it. Let me tell you how it went. I've been working on an oil rig for 15 years. Operational safety engineer, Santos Basin, schedule of 14 days offshore and 14 onshore. It's a life most people don't understand from the outside. You spend half your existence in the middle of the ocean, 150 kilometers from the coast, on a steel structure that vibrates 24 hours a day, with the noise of turbines and wind and sea. The other half you spend trying to reconnect with a world that moved on without you. Camila was the life I was trying to reconnect with, or at least that's what I believed. 6 years of marriage, an apartment in Florianopolis with an ocean view, a salary that came in every month without fail. She didn't work, not because I demanded she stay home, but because it was the agreement that slowly formed. In that way, certain agreements form in marriage without ever being said out loud. I produced, she managed, I boarded, she stayed, I sent, she spent. At that time, I called that a division of tasks. Today, I know the right name. The accident happened early on a Tuesday morning that I won't forget as long as I live. I was doing a routine inspection on a restricted access pipe, 3 floors below the main deck of the P-67 rig, when I felt the floor give way. It wasn't a collapse with a warning, it was that kind of silent failure the structure had been announcing for a long time and that nobody had heard right. The metal gave way beneath my feet, and I went with it. I don't remember screaming. I remember the impact, my left shoulder hitting first, my head later, and the ceiling up there, about 4 m from me, with the emergency light flashing orange, while the noise of the rig continued around me, as if nothing had happened. I stayed on the floor, unable to move, for a time. I can't say how long it was. When you're like that on the floor of a rig in the middle of the ocean with pain everywhere, time stops working the normal way. You don't think about big things, you think about small things. I thought about the coffee I'd had an hour earlier. I thought about Fabio, my colleague from Sarah, who'd asked me to bring peanut candy on the next boarding, cause his daughter missed the taste. I thought about my right hand, which was moving. I gave thanks. The rescue helicopter came before dawn. I looked up from below, already in the vest and stretcher, and saw the entire rig lit up in the dark of the ocean, that huge structure in the middle of nowhere. And I thought, 15 years of my life here. 15 years waking up to this smell of salt mixed with oil, missing Christmas, New Year's, wedding anniversaries. In the hospital in Makey, after the x-ray, after the doctor talked about a fractured humerus and bruised ribs and rest for at least 8 weeks, the nurse asked if I wanted to call someone. I said her name. Camila answered on the 3rd ring. I heard background noise, music, voices. It was 11 at night. I said I'd had an accident, that I was in the hospital, that my shoulder was fractured and that I'd need help in the coming weeks. She went quiet for a second, then asked, "But are you going to lose your job cause of this?" I didn't know what to answer, not because the question was cruel, though it was, but because in that moment I understood with that clarity that only comes when you're at the bottom and have no more illusions to hold on to, that this was her first concern, the job, the salary, the bank transfer on the 5th. Not if I was okay, not if I was going to recover, not if I needed anything that night. I said I didn't know yet, that the important thing was that I was alive. She said, "Thank goodness," with the same tone used to comment on the weather. I hung up. I kept looking at the white ceiling for a long time, in sickness and in health. I should have asked before repeating the oath what she understood by sickness, 'cause I just found out. I knew the name of every valve on the P67 rig. I knew where every register was, every inspection point, every stretch of piping that needed special attention. I knew Fabio snored in the top bunk and that Nilsson from Belém got mad when someone messed with the cabin's AC control. I knew Thursday's mess hall food was always better than Monday's, that the wind changed direction after 3 a.m., and that when the sky turned that specific shade of dark orange at the end of the day, the tide would get rough in the next few hours. 15 years offshore teach you to read everything, except what was happening inside my own house. The schedule was 14 by 14, 14 days at sea, 14 onshore. In theory, it's a balance. In practice, you live divided in two worlds that never truly meet. At sea, you're the engineer, the professional, the man other men call when something's wrong. At home, you try to be a husband, you try to be present, you try to fit into 14 days everything that was bottled up in the previous 2 weeks. And when you board again, life moves on without you. I just didn't know how it moved on. Camila and I met at a party in Florianopolis, on one of those summer nights when the city gets hot and everyone looks better than they are. She was 29, had long hair, a way of speaking that made it seem like she knew everything. I returned from a boarding 3 days prior and was still in that weird state of someone who needs to reconnect with a world of people around them. We talked all night. She thought it was cool that I worked on a rig. She said she'd never met anyone who did that. She asked me questions about the sea, about the size of the structure, about what it was like living far from the coast for weeks. At the time, I interpreted it as genuine curiosity. Today, I read it differently. She was calculating what that job represented financially. And the result of the calculation must have pleased her cause she didn't let go anymore. We stayed together, got married 2 years later. At first, the absence still had a charm. I'd arrived from boarding with accumulated longing, and she welcomed it well. We'd go out to dinner, stay home, enjoy the days. But charm has an expiration date, and it took me a while to see when hers ran out. The first sign I ignored happened in the 3rd year of marriage. I was offshore and sent a message asking what she was doing. She replied she was at home. 2 hours later, she was tagged in a photo on Instagram at a party in Lagoa de Conceição, with a large group of people I didn't know. When I got back and asked, she said she'd gone out at the last minute, that it wasn't a big deal that I didn't need to know every detail of her life. I agreed. That was the day I set, unintentionally, the wrong bar. From then on, the bar only lowered. During the boardings, I transferred 4,500 reais to her account every month, besides the house expenses that came straight off my card. Rent, condo fees, groceries, health insurance, the gym she went to 3 times a year, streaming subscriptions, light bill, water bill. I paid for everything. The 4,500 reais were for her to have what she called independence. In practice, they were for her to do whatever she wanted without consulting me. What she wanted I found out little by little. Dinners at Japanese restaurants on the North Shore. Weekends in Gramado with her friends. Boat rides in Jura with people I'd never seen. Designer blouses that appeared in the closet with no backstory. She never actively hid any of this. She just didn't tell. And there I was in the middle of the ocean receiving a photo every now and then, giving it a like, sending a heart, and going back to work, thinking everything was fine because she seemed happy. Happy with what? I didn't stop to ask. There's a WhatsApp group we kept on the rig. Me, Fabio, Nilsson, Robson from Fortaleza, Mauricio from Espírito Santo, and about 4 others. It was the group we used to send memes, complain about the cafeteria menu, let others know when there was double dessert at dinner. One time Fabio sent a 2-minute audio just to tell us his daughter had learned to ride a bike and he hadn't been there to see it. We stayed quiet in the group for a while after that. Nobody needed a comment. Every offshore man carries a version of that audio. The birthday he didn't attend, the school meeting the wife's friend filled in for, the Sunday barbecue that turned into a photo in the family group while you were doing an inspection 150 kilometers from a coast. You pay the price of absence, thinking the salary covers the bill. It doesn't. But Camila never complained about the absence using that word. She complained in other ways. She'd say it was hard to solve everything alone, that the plumber had come and she hadn't understood what he explained, that the condo meeting was boring and she had to go because I was never there. Functional complaints, practical daily stuff. She never said she missed me, never said she wanted me to be there. She only said it was hard to manage the house without help. And I, an award-winning idiot, felt guilty and transferred more money. When I came back from boarding, she was always fine, well-dressed, in a good mood. Very busy. The house smelled of scented candles. She always had some plan to tell me about. Someplace she wanted to go. I thought that was life working. It was her working very well without me and needing to fit my presence into the script for 14 days before I vanished again. On my last boarding before the accident, we went 3 days without really talking, not because of a fight, but lack of topics. I'd send a message. She'd reply with little. I didn't insist. In 15 years on the rig, I learned that misdirected energy tires you out more than heavy work. And keeping a conversation going with someone who's on the other side only in body is the kind of effort that drains without giving anything back. The night before the accident, I was in the cabin, Fabio already snoring in the top bunk, and I kept looking at the ceiling, thinking that when I got back I wanted to sit with her and truly talk, the way we'd stopped doing without noticing. No phone in hand, no TV, no plans set for the next day. Just talk. I never had that conversation. The next day, the floor gave way and I went with it. And when I called from the hospital, the first thing she asked about was the job. Now, sitting in the living room of our house in Florianopolis with my arm immobilized and a spoon of yogurt I'd barely managed to open alone, I kept looking out the window at the sea down below and thinking about something Fabio had said once in the cafeteria, between one forkful of beans and another. Marcos, a man who works at sea, can't have an anchor at home that sinks. I found it funny at the time. Now I understood he was warning me. Physical pain, you learn to manage. There's a rhythm to it. The meds every 8 hours, the ice on the shoulder morning and night, the right position to lie down, which takes about 2 days to figure out, and when you find it feels like a small victory. The body complains, you negotiate, it slowly gives in. Physical therapy was going to start the following week. The doctor had said that with 2 months of dedication, I'd get back a good part of the movement. With 4, probably all of it. For months I can handle. What I didn't know how to manage was her silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. The silence of someone who chooses not to speak because you stop being interesting. There's a huge difference between the two, and you only learn to distinguish them when you're on the wrong side. In the first few days at home, I still try to maintain some normality. I'd wake up, take the med, stay in the living room. She'd wake up later, pass through the living room, say good morning without stopping, go to the kitchen, make her coffee, go back to the bedroom with her laptop. That was the morning script. Lunch she'd eat in front of the computer, or she'd go out. Dinner was each on their own time, in their own corner. I'd heat up whatever there was or order delivery with my good hand. She'd arrive having already eaten. On the third night, I asked her to help me change my shoulder bandage. It was a simple thing. The hospital nurse had taught me the procedure in 5 minutes, but with one arm immobilized and the other still limited by the impact, certain positions were impossible to reach alone. She came, did it, said nothing during the whole process. When she finished, she washed her hands in the bathroom sink for longer than she needed to, as if she were washing the episode away along with the soap suds. I said thanks. She said you're welcome with the voice of someone answering on autopilot. On the 5th day, I tried to talk, not about us, about anything. I asked about her friend, Deborah, who I knew was going through a separation. I asked if the upstairs apartment renovation was finished, cause the noise had bothered me so much before I boarded. I asked if the market near our house had opened the produce section they'd been promising for a long time. She answered everything with the minimum possible 2, 3 words, sometimes 1, and would go back to looking at her phone with that naturalness of someone who closed a subject without needing to say she closed it. I kept looking at her and trying to find the woman from the party in Florianopolis who'd stayed up with me until 4 in the morning, talking about everything, about family, about dreams, about how she wanted to visit northern Italy one day, about how I described the sunset in the middle of the ocean in a way she said she'd never heard anyone describe. That woman was gone, or maybe she'd never existed the way I remembered. On the 7th day, I slipped. It wasn't a dramatic fall, just my foot losing its grip on the edge of the bathroom mat, my body going one way and my good arm going the other, trying to hold on. I didn't fall completely, but I hit my knee on the edge of the toilet and the impact reached my shoulder like a shock. I stayed crouched for a few seconds, taking deep breaths, waiting for the pain to pass. I called out to her, not in a desperate scream. I called in a normal way with the volume of someone who knows the person is in the next room. Silence. I called again. I heard the sound of the bedroom TV, that decoration show she watched every afternoon, where the blonde host renovates the apartment and everyone is surprised at the end, as if they didn't know what was coming. I called a third time, now a little louder. Nothing. I stayed on the bathroom floor for 14 minutes. I counted on the wall clock that was visible through the half-open door, 14 minutes until I managed to get up alone, using the wall for support, my knee throbbing, my shoulder protesting every centimeter of the movement. When I left the bathroom, I passed by the bedroom. The door was cracked open. She was in the middle of the bed, leaning against the pillow with wireless earbuds in both ears. Looking at the show, she saw me pass, didn't take off the earbuds. I went to the living room, sat on the couch, and kept looking out the window at the sea for a while, without thinking of anything specific. Sometimes, our heads do that as a protection. It shuts down before you command it to. It was 2 days later that she said the sentence. I was trying to open a jar of jelly with my good hand, one of those ridiculous tasks that the injury turns into a challenge. She walked into the kitchen, saw what I was doing, grabbed the jar, opened it in 2 seconds, put it on the counter, and stood next to me for a moment. I thought she was going to say something kind. She said, "You know this is going to last for months, right?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of the kind that carries a weight behind it that she hadn't yet put into words. I said the doctor had mentioned 2 to 4 months for a full recovery. She went quiet for a second, picked up the phone that was on the counter, looked at the screen, put it down again. Then she said, "I didn't get married to become the caregiver of an invalid husband." She said it with a calm voice, without anger, without crying, without drama, with that calm that's worse than any scream, because it indicates the person has already processed what they're saying a long time ago and is just verbalizing it now. I didn't answer. She left the kitchen. I stood still in front of the counter with the open jelly jar in front of me and a strange feeling in my chest that wasn't exactly pain and wasn't exactly surprise. It was more that feeling of when something you knew deep down finally rises to the surface and you stand there facing it, not really knowing what to do with so much visible weight all at once. 15 years at sea, 15 years of Christmases in the cabin, of wedding anniversaries celebrated via text message, of parties I didn't attend, of problems I solved over the phone, of early mornings when I woke up in the middle of the ocean, wondering if she was okay. 15 years funding a life she now called a burden. I grabbed the jelly, spread on the bread, ate it standing right there in front of the counter, looking out the kitchen window at the building next door. A pigeon was perched on the front sill. It kept looking at me for a while with that pigeon face that reveals nothing. Then it left. I thought it made sense. That night, lying in the bedroom with the dark ceiling above me and her already sleeping on her side, with that body distance that had become the standard between us, I kept thinking about something my dad used to say when I was a boy in the countryside of Pernambuco, before I went to college. Before the career, before all this. He used to say that land that doesn't produce the owner abandons, but a man who doesn't produce the woman also abandons. He said it with that practical philosophy of someone who never read a self-help book, but understood life a different way. I disagreed with that my entire life. I thought it was an old, limited view from that time when the woman stayed home and the man worked, and the value of each was measured by function. But lying there that night, with my shoulder throbbing and her voice still echoing in the kitchen, I thought maybe my dad wasn't talking about an era. Maybe he was describing a specific person I was yet to meet. Except he was no longer here to warn me. What he had was a brother, and that brother I still hadn't called yet. If you made it this far in this story, you already know it goes deep. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share with someone who needs to hear this. Comment down below what you're feeling, cause this story still has much more to reveal. Loneliness inside a home is a different deal from any other loneliness that exists. When you're truly alone, with nobody around, at least the silence is honest. It doesn't fake it, doesn't share the same roof with you and act as if you were a plant that doesn't need attention. Real loneliness has a strange integrity. You know what it is, accept what it is, make do with what it is. Now, loneliness inside a marriage is something else. This one hurts differently, because you're looking at the person and she's looking somewhere else. Because you start calculating the right moment to speak so as not to bother. Because you start feeling like a visitor in your own living room. You learn her schedules so you don't cross paths. You learn the tone of voice that indicates she doesn't want to chat. You learn to take up the least space possible inside a house you paid for every centimeter of with your work. I learned all that in less than 2 weeks. She'd leave early, sometimes before I woke up. She'd leave the coffee maker on automatic, which I interpreted on the first day as care. And I understood on the second that it was just the timer she'd programmed for herself. The coffee would be ready at 7:30. If I got to the kitchen at 8, it was there. If she left at 7:40, the coffee was also for her. I only showed up later. Lunch, I'd figure out alone. I'd learned to manage with one hand in a way that would put any occupational therapist to shame with pride. I learned that instant noodles don't need strength to open, that scrambled eggs are possible with one good hand and patience, that bread with cold cuts is underrated when you have no better option. I ate a lot of bland things those weeks, but I ate. Nobody died from a lack of seasoning. She'd arrive late afternoon, sometimes early evening, always with a small explanation that I stopped questioning, because the answers were always smaller than the question deserved. Meeting. Appointment. Met up with Deborah. Dropped by a store. Explanations that existed just to fill the mandatory silence of someone who still shared an address with another person. On one of those late afternoons, she arrived earlier than usual. I was on the couch with my arm resting on the pillow, trying to read something on my phone. She came in, tossed her bag on the bench near the door, went straight to the kitchen. I heard the fridge open, close, the faucet, the microwave. About 20 minutes later, she passed through the living room with a plate and went to the bedroom. She didn't say if it went well, didn't say where she'd been, didn't ask how I'd spend the day. I didn't say anything either, but her phone had been left on the bench near the door. I looked at it for a while. I wasn't thinking of messing with it, nor did I know the password. I kept looking because it was in my field of vision, and my head didn't have much more to process that day, beyond what was right before my eyes. Then the screen lit up. Notification. She didn't have her phone locked with a password, just a swipe pattern that anyone could unlock by accident. The screen lit up and showed Deborah's name with a message preview. I didn't mess with it, didn't go over there, didn't grab the device, but the screen stayed lit for about 30 seconds before turning off. Enough time for me to read enough. Deborah had sent. So have you decided what you're going to do? 'Cause the apartment won't be available forever. I stood still. I read it again, just to be sure I'd read it right. I had. That night it took me a while to fall asleep, and I kept putting it together piece by piece in my head. Not in a paranoid way, in a mathematical way, the way an engineer thinks when they need to understand a failure. You don't invent, you collect data, organize, analyze, arrive at a conclusion the data supports. The data I had was this. She'd spent less than 10 minutes on the hospital call in Makey about the accident, and her first question was about the job. She hadn't gone to pick me up. She'd said I was a burden without changing her tone of voice. She spent the day out without explaining where, and Deborah, her friend who was going through a separation, was asking about an apartment. An apartment that hadn't been mentioned in any conversation with me. In none. In 6 years of marriage, at no point had she said she wanted to move apartments, look for another place, see other options. We had that ocean view apartment, which I paid rent for every month on auto pay like it was a tax. She never complained about the apartment. She complained about me. About the apartment, never. So what for a new apartment? For who? The next day, she left early in the morning again. I drank the timer coffee, which wasn't for me. I stayed in the living room for a while, and then decided to do what I hadn't done in days. Go out not far, just to the bakery on the corner. There was an old baker there, Mr. Agenor, who always recognized me when I returned from boarding and asked how it went. He was the type of person who genuinely asks, looking you in the eyes, waiting for the answer. Not the type who asks while already thinking about the next thing. I went on foot, slowly, with my arm in a sling, in the pace of someone who learned that rushing doesn't work anymore. Mr. Agenor was there, saw me walk in, looked at my arm, frowned. What happened there, Marcos? I told him about the accident, the hospital, the recovery. He listened to it all leaning on the counter, arms crossed, nodding his head the way an older man does when processing something he recognizes. When I finished, he went quiet for a second. Then he said, "And is your missus helping you well?" I smiled with half my mouth. He understood without me needing to answer. He gave me a cheese bread without charging me. He said it was on the house, and changed the subject to a figurance game he was indignant about. I stayed there about 20 minutes in the bakery talking about Santa Catarina soccer with a 60-something-year-old man I barely knew, and that was the closest thing to care I'd received since I came back home. When I got back to the apartment, she had returned. She was in the kitchen with her hair tied up, fresh makeup, different clothes from the morning. She'd gone out and come back while I was at the bakery. I asked where she'd gone. She said to take care of some things. I said, "What things?" She said, "My things, Marcos." The way she said my name, with that end of conversation intonation, I understood I was being warned about where the boundary was. My name in her mouth had become a sign of closure. I went to the living room, sat on the couch, and kept looking at the sea through the window again, that huge and indifferent sea down below. And I thought about how many times I'd looked at the ocean from the rig, missing this view. Now I had the view and felt nothing, because the longing I had wasn't for the place, it was for someone who'd never existed, the way I needed her to exist. That night, while she slept, I grabbed my phone and opened the chat with my Uncle Dorival. We hadn't spoken for almost 2 years. His last audio had been on the 1-year anniversary of my dad's death. He'd sent a short message, deep voice, heavy Kuru accent. "Your dad was the best man I ever knew, and you're going to be too. It might take a while, but you will." I listened to that audio about 6 times back then. Now I opened the chat and kept looking at it in the dark of the bedroom for a long time. It wasn't time to send a message yet, but I was already thinking about what I was going to say. Nobody warned me they were coming. It was a Thursday morning. She'd left early, as always, and I was in the living room trying to do the mobility exercise the physical therapist had sent via video. Slow movement with the shoulder within the pain limit, 3 sets of 10. It sounds simple. When you're doing it, every rep is a negotiation with your own body. I was on the second set when I heard the loud knock on the door. That knock of someone who has no doubt they'll be answered. I opened it. Fabio from Sarah was at the door with a grocery bag in each hand and a smile of someone who'd just taken a plane trip and thought it was the most natural thing in the world. Next to him, Nilsson from Belém, shorter, quieter, with a backpack on his back and a thermal lunchbox under his arm, which I recognized immediately, because it was identical to the one his mom sent every time he returned to Belém on his days off. I stood at the door without saying anything for about 3 seconds. Fabio said, "Are you going to leave me on the threshold or invite me in?" I stepped back, they came in. Fabio went straight to the kitchen, opened the bags on the counter, started organizing what he'd brought with the naturalness of someone who's known the house for years. Nilsson put his backpack on the bench, placed a lunchbox on the table, looked around with those calm eyes he always had and said, "You look like someone who hasn't eaten right in weeks." I said I was making do. He said he could see that. Neither of them asked about her. They didn't ask if she knew they were coming. They didn't ask where she was. They didn't ask any questions I needed to answer with a lie or with embarrassment. They acted as if they'd agreed among themselves what they weren't going to say and arrived just like that directly, without ceremony, without that weight of a visitor who feels they need to be invited. That's a very specific way of caring that rig men learn and the outside world rarely understands. Inside the rig, you don't ask your colleague if he's okay when you see he's not. You stand by him. You share the shift, share the mess hall food, share the silence when it's silence the other needs, and share the conversation when it's conversation. You don't turn care into an event, you just show up. Fabio and Nilsson showed up with free-range chicken marinated since the night before, rice with herbs, beans with bacon, buttered farofa, and a block of guava paste Fabio had bought at market. 'Cause, according to him, a hospital without dessert cures nobody. We ate lunch at the living room table with the window open, a breeze coming in, the street noise down below. I ate more at that lunch than in all the meals of the previous week combined. Not just 'cause the food was too good for any comparison with what I'd been eating, but 'cause food made with intention has a flavor that has no recipe. You feel someone thought of you while cooking. It makes a difference. After lunch, Fabio went to wash the dishes without being asked. Nilsson helped clear the table. I sat there watching that and got a strange, almost uncomfortable feeling of not knowing how to react when someone just does something without asking for anything in return. I spent weeks in a house with my wife, and I don't remember a single time she washed the dishes without me hearing the sound of the sponge, as if it were a punishment. Fabio came back from the kitchen, threw himself on the couch, put his feet on the arm of the other couch, the way he always did in the rig cabin, looked at the ceiling and said, "This apartment has a good view." I said it did. He stayed quiet for a second. Then, and Camila, I said she was fine. He didn't say anything else, but the way he kept looking at the ceiling for a few more seconds after that told me the answer I gave hadn't fooled anyone. Nilsson was near the window, looking down, and said without turning around, "You know what's funny, Marcos? We get hurt on the rig, and the company sends a form, occupational safety, send a procedure, HR, send a protocol, everything very organized. Except the ones who really show up are us. It's always been like that." I agreed. He turned and said, "I'm glad you're okay." Nilsson from Bulem isn't a man of long speeches, but when he speaks, there's no wasted word. They stayed 3 days, slept on the couch and the guest bed complaining about nothing. They bought groceries, cooked, went to the pharmacy to get the anti-inflammatory I'd forgotten to ask for. They played cards at the living room table until midnight, while I participated with my good hand and lost every round without caring the slightest bit, because it wasn't about winning, it was about being there. Camila arrived at the end of the first day, saw both of them in the living room, greeted them with a short smile, said she didn't know they'd have visitors, went to the bedroom. She came out only to get water during the night. The next day, she left early again. On the third day, as she passed through the living room to leave, Fabio said, "Good morning," with that open Sarah voice that takes up the whole room. She replied without stopping. The door closed. Fabio kept looking at the door for a second, then took a sip of his coffee and said nothing. But late that afternoon on the balcony, while Nilsson was inside watching something on TV, Fabio and I sat watching the sun go down behind the buildings on the other side of the shore. That time of day in Florianopolis, when it feels like the whole city breathes slower. Fabio had a beer he'd bought. I had a juice 'cause the meds didn't allow alcohol. We stayed like that for a while, without needing to speak. Then he said, "You never told her about your Uncle Marcos." It wasn't a question. I said no. He said, "Why?" I thought before answering, not 'cause the answer was complicated, 'cause it was too simple, and I was still getting used to what that simplicity revealed. I said 'cause she never asked. Fabio kept looking at the horizon, shook his head slightly. "And how long of marriage?" 6 years. He went quiet again after. 6 years, and she never wanted to know where you came from. It wasn't a question either. I didn't answer 'cause he hadn't asked. He was just organizing out loud what we both already knew. There's a type of person who relates to you from the outside in. She sees what you produce, what you offer, what you represent in her life. She never goes deep, never asks about your father, about your childhood, about the city where you grew up, about who taught you what you know. She consumes the result and never has curiosity about the process. Camila knew I worked on a rig, knew my salary, knew my schedule, knew I wore PP, and that the helicopter landed in Makey. She didn't know the name of my best childhood friend. She didn't know my dad had died of pride when I got into engineering college in Recife. She didn't know I had an uncle who'd left the hinterland with nothing and built a company with his own bare hands. She never asked. In 6 years, she never asked. When Fabio and Nilsson left on the morning of the 4th day, I went to the door with them. Fabio gave me a careful hug, avoiding the shoulder, that way of hugging of someone who knows where it hurts. Nilsson shook my hand, held it for a second, said, "Anything you need, we're here." I said I knew. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, with my hand still on the doorknob, looking at the empty apartment. Empty again, but different from the emptiness before. Before it was lack, now it was space. Space I needed to use for something. I went back to the living room, sat down, grabbed my phone, opened the chat with Uncle Dorival, kept looking at the last message he'd sent, that audio from the anniversary of my dad's death, his deep voice saying I was going to be the best man I could be and that it might take time. But I typed, "Uncle, I had an accident. I'm resting. Just wanted to say hi." I paused, read it again, sent it. The double check mark appeared super fast. He had his phone in hand, spent a few minutes without replying, and I was already putting the phone aside when the screen lit up. An audio, 23 seconds. I hit play. His voice was exactly as I remembered, deep, slow, with that countryside Pernambuco accent that no amount of years in the city erases. "Marcos, how good to hear you, boy. Accident, how are you? Where are you? Pause. Send me the address. I'm going there." I listened to it 3 times. Then I looked out the window at the sea outside, and for the first time in weeks, I took a deep breath without the pain coming along. I sent the address. He replied with an okay and a 4-second audio, saying he was going to check tickets, without drama, without long questions, without that ritual of someone who needs 3 days' notice and a confirmed schedule to make a move. Dorival Queiroz was the type of man who decides and acts. I learned that about him that night in the cemetery parking lot, when he showed up in a suit that wasn't the right size, leather hat in hand, and was the only one present who didn't say my dad was in a better place. He said, "Your dad was a real man. Those are the ones we miss the most." Then he stood by my side for 2 hours, without needing to say anything else. A man who stays is rarer than a man who talks. While I waited for his confirmation, I spent the afternoon doing what I'd avoided doing in the previous weeks. Actually thinking, not that shallow thinking of someone who keeps repeating their own pain on a loop. Actually thinking is different. Sitting with the discomfort, looking at it straight on, and asking the questions you've been sweeping under the rug. The first question was the simplest and the heaviest at the same time. At what moment did I stop seeing what was right in front of me? It wasn't a victim's question, it was an engineer's question. When you have a structural failure, you don't just stare at the damage. You go back into the history, identify the point of origin, understand how the deterioration advanced undetected. You do this not to blame yourself, but to understand, so you don't repeat it. I went back into the history, found things I'd rather not have found. I found a number of times I ignored a clear sign, because it was more comfortable to ignore than to face. I found conversations I ended prematurely, because she got impatient, and I prefer to back down rather than insist. I found decisions I made based on what she wanted, without asking what I wanted. Not because she demanded it, but because I gave in before being asked, which is the worst kind of surrender, because you don't even have anyone to blame. We build our own cage and think it's a home. The second thought was even harder. I was 41 years old, 15 of an offshore career, a technical resume few engineers in Brazil had. I knew the rig inside out like nobody else. I knew how to identify a risk before it became an accident. I knew how to lead a team in extreme conditions. I knew how to operate under pressure in an environment where a mistake has real and immediate consequences. I'd built a solid reputation in a sector that doesn't forgive incompetence. And at home, I asked for permission to speak. This contradiction stood in front of me like math that doesn't add up. The same man who coordinated high-risk operations 100 m above the ocean stayed quiet when his wife used her subject closing tone. Not out of fear of her, out of habit, out of that silent erosion that happens when you slowly give in day after day, until the day you look in the mirror and don't recognize your posture. The rig doesn't let you forget who you are. Home did. The following afternoon, Dorival texted, "Ticket bought. arriving Saturday morning. Flight from Recife with a layover in Guarulhos. I looked at the phone for a while, then realized I had a problem. She didn't know he was coming, and I didn't know how to explain who he was without opening a subject we both knew was bound to be opened. Except neither of us had formally initiated it. Divorce hovered over the apartment like that winter fog that covers Floripa and that the whole city fakes not seeing until you can't see anything anymore. I decided not to tell. Not for strategy, out of exhaustion. I had no more energy to pre-explain, to set the ground, to soften information that didn't need softening. She'd see when he arrived, and she'd react however she reacted. I'd stopped adjusting my world around her reactions. That I realized in that moment was new. That was me returning on Friday night. She came home earlier than usual. I was at the table with my laptop, trying to answer some company emails about my medical leave and the return procedures. She walked in, threw her bag, went to the kitchen, and to my surprise, started making something for dinner. I heard the noise of the frying pan, the smell of golden garlic, the sound of the pot. I kept looking at the laptop, unable to read anything. She brought 2 plates to the table, garlic and oil pasta with shrimp. That recipe she made so well since we'd just gotten married, and that had vanished from the domestic menu along with several other things that I couldn't say when they left. She sat on the opposite side of the table. We ate in silence for a while. Then she said, without lifting her gaze from her plate, "Are you really going to stay all this time without working?" It wasn't a question. It was the beginning of a conversation she'd been putting together for days and had decided to unleash that night. I said the doctor had ordered the leave and the company was following protocol. She said, and financially, I said the insurance covered the period and Social Security supplemented it, that we wouldn't feel a significant difference in the short term. She kept stirring the pasta with her fork for a moment. She said, "I'm thinking of doing some things." I said, "What things?" She said, "Things for myself, investment, personal project." I looked at her. She still hadn't lifted her gaze from her plate. I said, "Personal project, like what?" She said, "I'm still formulating it." And that was the end of the conversation. She finished eating, washed her plate, went to the bedroom. I stayed at the table alone with my half-eaten plate and the frying pan with the leftover shrimp getting cold on the stove. Personal project, apartment in Campeche. Lawyer consulted before I got home from the hospital. I wasn't an operational safety engineer for nothing. My job was to identify what was about to give way before it gave way, and everything I'd been seeing in front of me for weeks. It only had one possible reading. She was already leaving, just hadn't said it out loud yet. That night, while she slept, I stayed awake with the dark ceiling above me, thinking about my dad, not in a melancholic way, not with that longing that paralyzes, thinking about him in a practical way, the way he himself would have liked to be remembered. He was a man of solutions, didn't like standing still facing a problem. He'd say a stagnant problem ferments, and fermented stuff either turns into booze or turns into ruin. Dad didn't drink, so he solved it. I thought about what he'd do in my place, with an immobilized shoulder, a wife planning her exit, and a whole life of work that suddenly felt like it had been built for the wrong person. He'd call his brother. That I knew without needing to think much. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the years without contact, despite the old family feud I never fully understood, because adults don't explain adult fights to kids, my dad spoke of Dorival with a specific respect. The kind of respect reserved for those who earned it, without asking for favors. Your uncle left Peru with a backpack and a skill, my dad used to say, and never forgot where he came from. That's worth more than a diploma. I had the diploma, I had Dorival. And on Saturday morning, while she was still sleeping, I heard the intercom ring. I went to the panel on the living room wall, still in my pajamas, arm in the sling. I pushed the button. Yes. The voice came out raspy, slow, with the unmistakable accent of the Pernambuco hinterland. "It's Dorival. I'm down here." I closed my eyes for a second, pushed the door release, went to the living room window, and looked down at the sidewalk with a small carry-on bag, a dark leather hat he must have worn since before I was born, a blue plaid shirt and twill pants. Stood a 63-year-old man who looked like he'd stepped straight out of the Pernambuco countryside and arrived in Florianopolis with no rush to adapt to anything. He looked up, found me at the window, raised his hand. I raised mine. There were things that needed no words. 30 seconds in the elevator, and he'd be at my door. And something that had been stuck inside me for weeks was going to start moving. I heard the sound of her moving in the bedroom. She was waking up, and I thought, all right, you can wake up, you can come see. Because what was about to walk through my door was the answer to a question she never had the curiosity to ask. She came out of the bedroom at 8:20 a.m. with her hair tied up and the expression of someone who hadn't truly woken up yet. I was in the living room. Dorival was on the couch with the coffee I'd made, holding the cup with both hands, the way a countryman holds a cup, as if the heat of the porcelain was part of the ritual. He'd arrived 15 minutes earlier. We were still in that initial moment of two relatives reuniting after a long time and needing a few minutes to calibrate the distance time created. He'd hug me at the door, carefully, avoiding the shoulder, just like Fabio had done, that instinct of someone who sees where the other is hurt without needing to ask. He'd looked at me for a second, assessing, and said, "You're thinner." I said, "The hospital does that to you." He said, "Hospital and a bad woman both make you lose weight." I neither confirmed nor denied. He didn't need confirmation. When she appeared in the hallway and saw an unknown man sitting on the living room couch, she stopped. Not out of fright, but in that way of someone who needs a second to reorganize the scene in front of them. She looked at me. I said, "This is my uncle Dorival. He came from Recife." She looked at him. Dorival slightly raised his head, made the contained gesture of greeting an older countryman does when being introduced to someone he doesn't know how to evaluate yet. It wasn't coldness, it was reservation. There's a difference. She said hi with the surface smile I already knew by heart. The smile she used when she needed to seem kind without wanting to be. Went to the kitchen to make her coffee. Dorival followed her movement with his eyes until she disappeared. Then he brought his gaze back to me and said nothing. He took a sip of coffee. I sat in the chair, facing him. We stayed talking for almost an hour while she stayed in the bedroom. We talked about my dad, about Crew, about a distant cousin who'd opened a tire shop in Campina Grande and was doing well. We talked about the rig, about the accident, about the recovery process. Dorival listened with that specific attention of someone who isn't waiting for their turn to speak. He was actually listening, processing, storing. At some point he said, "You were always the most like your dad, not in the face and the manner. A man who endures without complaining too much and solves things without making noise." I said, "Sometimes enduring without complaining becomes a bad habit." He nodded his head. "It does, but are you realizing it? That's already different." She came out of the bedroom around 10, dressed up, bag on her shoulder, keys in hand. She stopped for a second at the entrance to the living room. She said she was going to take care of some things and didn't know what time she'd be back. I said, "All right." She looked at Dorival for a second, that quick assessing look she thought was discreet, but wasn't. Then she left. The door closed. Dorival kept looking at the door for a moment, then said very slowly, with that voice that seemed to come from a deep place, "Does she know what she has in her hands, boy?" I said no. He said her loss. And it was with that sentence that the real conversation began. Dorival put the cup down on the coffee table, settled into the couch with that way of someone who's going to stay right where he is for as long as necessary, and began to speak, not dramatically, not with the weight of revelation the situation deserved. He spoke with the naturalness of someone recounting a company's history in a meeting. Cause to him, that's exactly what it was. He'd left Carew at 22 with a backpack, a technical degree in industrial mechanics, and a small debt a different uncle had taken out at his name to cover the ticket. He'd arrived in Recife, knowing no one, and gotten a job as a maintenance assistant at a company that serviced a refinery. He spent 6 years learning everything he could learn, night shifts when available, weekends when needed. At 28, he'd opened a 2-employee company, providing preventive maintenance services for the local industry. At 35, the company had 23 employees and its first contract with a Petrobras supplier. At 48, he'd expanded into predictive inspection and maintenance on offshore rigs, a specific technical niche that required knowledge few companies in Brazil had built with the necessary rigor. Today, Queiroz Technical Services, registered in Recife, with an operational branch in Maki, had 117 direct employees, active contracts with 3 offshore operators, and an annual revenue, which he stated with the same naturalness as he would the price of beans at the market. 47 million reis. I heard the number and spent a second processing. Not cause it surprised me he'd prospered. My dad always said his brother was a man of results. The size of what he'd built in silence surprised me, without appearing on anyone's Instagram, without needing the world to know. He saw my expression and said, I didn't do it to impress. I did it because it's what needed to be done. That sentence I held on to. And he got to the point I wasn't expecting him to reach so directly. He said, Marcos, I came cause you called me, but I also came cause I've been waiting for the right moment for a long time. Pause. I need you in the company. I said nothing. He continued. Kairos was opening an operational branch in Santos, not in Makey, which was the obvious hub of the sector. Exactly, cause every competitor was already there. Santos had a strategic position to serve the Santos Basin with a more agile response structure, and the market was being underestimated by the big guys. He'd identified that 2 years prior and was setting up the move now. What he needed wasn't just a manager. It was a technical partner, someone who knew the inside of rigs like their own home, who had credibility built in the field, whom the teams respected not for a title, but for real knowledge. 15 years on a rig, Marcos. You know what that represents on a technical resume in this sector? I said I knew. He said, then you know what I'm offering isn't a favor, it's business. You come in as a technical partner with 22% of the Santos branch. An initial stipend, profit sharing starting the second year. 22% of a branch of a company making 47 million. I needed a moment, not to do the math, to understand that life sometimes has a timing we don't plan, and that it arrives in a way that feels like fiction, but is just the delayed consequence of everything you built without realizing you were building it. I said, Uncle, my arm is immobilized and I'm on medical leave. He said, I know, that's why the contract starts in 90 days, enough time for you to recover and for us to structure the opening of the branch. I kept looking at him. He kept looking at me. Outside, the noise of the street, the Florianopolis breeze coming through the half-open window, the distant sound of the sea that I no longer heard as a beautiful thing and that in that moment sounded familiar again. I said, I need to think. He said, of course. Picked up his cup, finished his coffee, set it down. But while you think, tell me something. I said, what? He said, was the accident the fault of equipment failure or procedural failure? I said, both. The structure had been showing signs and the inspection protocol was overdue. He shook his head slowly. It's always both, always. Pause. Just like here. I understood what he meant without him needing to explain. The structure had been showing signs for a long time, and I had an overdue inspection protocol within my own life. He stayed for 3 days. In that period, Camila stayed home more and more. Not cause she changed her routine, but cause it seemed a rival's presence created a gravitational field she didn't know how to navigate. She wasn't one to feel uncomfortable easily, but something about him bothered her in a way she couldn't name. Maybe it was the way he looked. Dorival had the look of someone who'd seen too much to be impressed by surfaces. When he looked at a person, he truly looked. And there are people who can't stand being truly looked at because they live their whole lives preventing anyone from seeing too deep. On the second day, she tried having a conversation with him, asked about Recife, about the heat there, about whether he knew such and such restaurant a friend of hers had recommended. He answered politely and without enthusiasm. He wasn't rude, he was exact. Answered what was asked and didn't go beyond. She gave up after 2 minutes. On the third night, the 3 of us were in the living room at the same time for the first time. She'd arrived earlier. Dorival was watching a regional newscast on low volume. I was in the chair with my laptop. She poured herself some water in the kitchen, came back, stood still for a second, looking around the room. Then she said, to no one in particular, so you guys are close. Dorival said without taking his eyes off the news. Family is family. She stood there for another second, then went to the bedroom. Dorival waited for the door to close. Then he looked at me and said quietly with that voice that was in no rush for anything. She hasn't asked a single question about me since I arrived. I said I knew. He said, in 3 days, not what I do, nor where I came from, and her why showed up. I said, she's like that. He said, I know. Pause. Your dad told me. I looked at him. He said, your dad called me 3 months before he died. We talk a lot. He was worried about you. Not about work, not about money, about you. I didn't know what to say. He continued. He said you'd married a woman who saw you on the outside, and that a man who's seen only on the outside becomes invisible on the inside over time. The bedroom light was off from inside the closed door. Outside, the sea continued the same way as always. And I sat there, understanding that my dad, even though he was no longer here, had still managed to send someone. She asked for a divorce on a Wednesday. It wasn't a scene, no crying, no gates crashing down, not that dramatic explosion we imagine when we think of a marriage ending. It was an administrative tone conversation, in that way she had of turning heavy stuff into meeting agendas. Sat in the living room chair with her phone in hand. I was on the couch, and she started talking like someone reading from a script they'd prepared beforehand. She said she'd consulted a lawyer, that we had the right to divide the assets acquired during the marriage, that the apartment was in her name and she intended to keep it, that the car in my name would stay with me. That joint accounts would be divided equally, and she'd already separated what was hers from what was mine in the documents we kept together in the bedroom drawer. She said all this with the voice of someone describing a change of address. When she finished, she kept looking at me, expecting a reaction. I gave none, not out of strength, not out of calculated strategy, out of exhaustion of specific kind, the kind that arrives when you spend too much time waiting for a bad thing to happen. And when it finally happens, you don't even have the energy to be surprised anymore. The surprise had already come weeks earlier in her tone of voice at the hospital, in the first question about the job, in the sentence in the kitchen. The divorce was just the formality of what I already knew. She said, you don't have anything to say? I said, I do, but it's not for you. She kept looking at me for a second with that expression of someone who doesn't know how to interpret what they heard. Then she got up, went to the bedroom, closed the door without slamming it. I stayed on the couch, looked out the window. The Florianopolis sky was that heavy winter gray the city knows well. That gray that isn't a storm, but isn't passing either, that stays. The shore down below was empty, just a lone runner on the sidewalk and a dog he walked on a leash with no rush at all. I grabbed my phone, texted Dorival. She asked. He replied in less than a minute. I expected it. Are you okay? I said I am. He said, then it's settled. Take care of your health. The rest we'll take care of together. I put the phone aside, and for the first time in a long time, I slept early and without waking up in the middle of the night. In the following days, something changed in the apartment, not in words, in atmosphere. She'd said what she had to say, and I hadn't answered what she expected. And this mismatch created a different kind of tension from before. Before it was the weight of things unsaid. Now it was the weight of things said that didn't have the calculated effect. She'd expected a reaction, begging maybe, or anger, which would be equally useful to her. Cause anger justifies the exit. Her silence didn't know what to do with my silence. We stayed as two silences inside an apartment for days, and hers grew increasingly restless, while mine grew increasingly firm. She started coming home earlier. I observed that without commenting. On Thursday, she made dinner again. Roast chicken this time, rice, salad. Placed 2 plates on the table without asking if I wanted some. We ate. She talked about a show she'd started watching. I listened, answered when I was supposed to answer. On Friday, she asked how my shoulder was. I said getting better. She said that's good. I understood she was trying something without knowing how to name what it was. It wasn't reconciliation, it was recalibration. She played her card, and the game hadn't responded as she expected. So she was trying to understand the new rules, without admitting the rules had changed. What she didn't know was what I knew, and what I knew was going to arrive on Saturday morning. I'd arranged with Dorival that he'd come sign the preliminary partnership documents in person. It didn't have to be like that. It could be done digitally, by proxy, by any of the means modern companies use to cut red tape. But Dorival was the type who signs paper looking into the other person's eyes. And I was the type who needed it to be real in a concrete, physical way, with a signature on paper with a pen. He arrived at 10 a.m. She was home. When the intercom rang, I went to answer it. She was in the kitchen. I said it was my uncle again, that he'd forgotten something on his last visit. She didn't reply, just heard the sound of a cup in the sink. I opened the door when he stepped out of the elevator. Dorival looked the exact same as always. Leather hat, a different shirt, but with the same plaid pattern, twill pants, a small bag. He also brought a document folder under his arm, one of those genuine leather folders worn at the edges from years of use. We greeted each other. He came in. I led him to the living room table. She appeared in the hallway a few minutes later, with her coffee cup in hand. Saw Dorival sitting at the table with the open folder and the documents organized in front of him. Saw me sitting on the opposite side. She stopped. This time the pause was different from all the previous ones. It wasn't the pause of someone processing new info. It was the pause of someone feeling that something's happening they weren't invited to understand. Dorival looked up from the documents and made that slight gesture of greeting. She said hi. Her voice came out slightly differently. "What is this?" I said, "We're going to sign some documents." She said, "What documents?" I said, "Company ones." She stood still for a second, then walked into the living room, didn't sit down, stood near the window, cup in hand, looking at the table. Dorival grabbed the first sheet, turned it my way, pointed to where I needed to sign. I explained in a low voice what each thing was as I signed. Not for her to hear, but cause it was my right to understand what I was signing. Partnership formation contract, technical participation clause, shareholder percentage, initial stipend. Standard confidentiality clause. She stood listening from afar. I saw out of the corner of my eye the moment she stopped pretending she wasn't paying attention. When I signed the last page, Dorival took the documents, organized them, put them back in the folder. Then he kept a separate sheet in his hand, different from the others, different letterhead, but formal. He said, "This right here is the company's asset valuation the accountant finalized last month. I left a copy for you to keep." I took it. Dorival had spoken in a completely normal voice, in the administrative meeting tone the conversation had kept. He wasn't telling me that for her to hear. He was giving me a document I had the right to have. But she heard and read the number in the header of the page I had in my hand. I saw when it happened. It wasn't a big movement, no drop cup, no noise. It was a small detail only seen by someone paying attention. The color left her face all at once. The way it leaves when the body receives info the mind hasn't processed yet, and the two disconnect for a second. She turned pale, not out of fright, out of calculation. I knew that expression. It was the same one she had when solving some math mentally. Except this time the math was revealing a result she hadn't included in the projections. For 6 years, she knew exactly how much I earned. She knew the salary, knew the hazard pay, knew the 13th month bonus, knew the bank transfer amount every month. She put my life on a spreadsheet without me knowing, managed what she thought was the ceiling of what I represented financially. What she didn't know was that this ceiling was never my ceiling. It was just the floor I was living on by choice. Dorival closed the folder calmly, looked at her for the first time since she'd entered the room, not with anger, with that honest attention he had with anyone. That look that goes deep and doesn't ask permission. He said, "Are you Camila?" It wasn't a question. She said, "I am." He said, "I'm Dorival, his dad's brother." 1 second pause. Did you know Marcos was the only one in the family who went to engineering college? His dad worked 20 years as a bricklayer to pay for his prep courses. He never told anyone outside the family, cause he wasn't a man who asked for recognition for doing what he thought was his duty. She said nothing. Dorival continued with the same tone, as if commenting on the weather. "The Queiroz family is like that. We build quietly, don't announce it, don't show off, only show up when needed." He looked at me, then back at her, and when we show up, it's cause it's already done. Silence. She was still standing near the window. The cup was in her hand, but she'd forgotten it was there. The coffee must have been cold for a long time. I grabbed the asset valuation sheet, folded it carefully, put it in my pocket. Dorival got up, grabbed his folder, held his hand out to me. We shook hands the way a man shakes a man's hand when they've closed a serious deal. "Firm, eye to eye." He said, 90 days. "Santos awaits you." I said, 90 days. He grabbed his hat he'd set on the chair next to him, put it on with that precise gesture of someone who's worn hats his whole life, grabbed his small bag he'd left near the door. looked at her one last time. "It was a pleasure, Mrs. Camilla." She said it was. Her voice came out small. He left, the door closed. She and I stayed in the apartment in silence for a moment that felt long, but probably wasn't. The sound of the elevator outside, the wind hitting the window, the sea down below that knows nothing about anyone and remains the same regardless of what happens on the floors above. She lowered her gaze to the cup still in her hand, put it on the table carefully. Then she said with a voice I'd never heard from her before. It wasn't the administrative divorce voice. It wasn't the bored kitchen voice. It was a smaller voice of someone trying to find their footing after realizing what they were stepping on wasn't what they thought. She said, "Marcos." I looked at her. She said, "I think we were hasty." I kept looking for a second. Then I said, "And what?" She said, "In that conversation we had about separating." Pause. I think I spoke in a rush. "I think we could talk better." I said, "We can talk, sure." She softened her expression slightly, the start of premature relief. I said, "But it's not going to change anything." The relief vanished. I got up from the couch with my usual care cause on my shoulder. I went to the bedroom to get the number of the lawyer a company colleague had recommended weeks before, when I still thought I wouldn't need it so soon. I was going to need it. And as I walked down the hall of the apartment I'd paid for 6 years, and in which I'd felt like a visitor these last weeks, I thought of my dad working 20 years as a bricklayer to pay for his son's prep courses. I thought of Dorival leaving Kourou with a backpack and building 47 million in silence. I thought of Fabio sending a 2-minute audio about his daughter learning to ride a bike. I thought of Mr. Eginor giving me cheese bread without charging me and changing the subject to figurantes. I thought of all the forms of real care I'd received in this life. None of them had come from who I expected them to come from. And for the first time since the accident, it didn't hurt me. It taught me. Santos has a smell Florianopolis doesn't have. It's not a bad smell. It's the smell of the port, of work, of things that move the world without asking anyone for permission. Oil, salt, heated metal, sea breeze mixed with diesel. The first time I stepped out of the car in front of the warehouse that would be the headquarters of Carraz's Santos branch, I took a deep breath and thought I was arriving at a place that already knew me before I arrived. 93 days after Dorival left my apartment in Florianopolis, I was in Santos with a recovered shoulder, my technical license renewed, and a signed contract that fundamentally changed everything I'd built so far. But let me tell you what happened in between, because the end of a marriage isn't a moment, it's a series of smaller moments that dismantle what existed piece by piece. And every piece that falls makes a different sound. After Dorival left that Saturday morning, she acted different, not regretful. 'Cause true regret has a specific texture we recognize when we see it. What she showed in the following days was something else. It was the behavior of someone who reevaluated a play and concluded their strategy needed adjusting. She tried for 2 weeks. She tried her own way, with that calculated subtlety of always. Made dinner 3 times, asked about my shoulder every morning, stopped going out so much. One night she sat next to me on the couch and stayed watching TV with me for 2 hours. That kind of physical closeness she knew had an effect on me in the past. When I returned from boarding with accumulated longing, and any gesture of hers was worth double. The past had passed. I was polite throughout that whole period. Answered when she asked, talked when she initiated it. I didn't create a difficult atmosphere. But I maintained a distance she couldn't cross cause it wasn't a distance of anger. Anger she'd know how to handle. It was a distance of decision. And a decision made with clarity has no edge to hold on to. In the second week, she tried a direct conversation, said she knew she'd been harsh in recent weeks, that the period had been hard for her too, that sometimes we say things we don't truly feel when under pressure. I heard it all. Then I asked, "Do you regret what you said?" She said she did. I said, "Which part?" She went a second without answering. Then she said, "All of it." I said, "Do you remember everything you said?" She said she did. I said, "Then you know there are things we don't say out of pressure. We say under pressure stuff that have been waiting for a way out for a long time." She kept looking at me. I said, "You didn't say anything you didn't think. You just said it before it was convenient." She didn't reply, not 'cause she had no argument, but 'cause deep down she knew I was right. And facing that out loud, was a level of honesty she wasn't prepared to have yet. The lawyer was fast, a direct man, small office in downtown Florianopolis, no nonsense. He analyzed the situation, confirmed what I already knew about the assets, guided me on the steps. The apartment stayed with her cause it was in her name since before the marriage, down payment paid by her family. The car in my name would stay with me. The joint account was divided. Simple, no legal battle, no long lawsuit. No separation war of the kind that consumes years and leaves both parties worse off than they were. I didn't want war. I wanted closure. We signed the documents at the notary office on a Tuesday afternoon. She was with her lawyer. I was with mine. We greeted each other at the entrance, stayed in the same room, signed the same pages with different pens. At no point did our eyes meet for more than a second. On the way out, she stopped me in the hallway, said, "I hope you're happy." I said, "Thanks." She said, "We could have been different." I kept looking at her for a second. That long hair, that way of positioning herself that always made it seem like she was about to present something. The woman from the Florianopolis party who'd stayed awake with me until 4 in the morning, the woman who asked about the job before asking if I was alive. I said, "I was what you saw. You never wanted to see more than that. So we were always going to arrive here." She stayed in silence. I greeted her lawyer. I stepped out onto the notary office sidewalk in Florianopolis. On a winter afternoon, with that south wind the city sends without warning, I stood still for a moment, just breathing, not thinking of anything specific, letting the air in and out while the street movement continued around me, indifferent as the world always is to people's personal stuff. Then I grabbed my phone and called Dorival. He answered on the second ring. I said, "It's signed." He said, "All right." I said, "It's all done." He said, "Then rest this weekend. Monday we start." I started on a Monday in March. The Santos branch was smaller than the Recife structure, but it had been set up with the precision Dorival applied to everything. Industrial warehouse in the right neighborhood, a lean and highly qualified technical team, inspection equipment I knew better than my own kitchen. When I walked in that first morning and saw the panels, the tools, the technical reports organized on the desk that would be mine, I felt something snap into place with that silent click that happens when you're exactly where you should be. The team welcomed me well, not with a party, with respect, which is better. They'd read my technical background, knew where I came from, how many years on rigs I had, what kind of operation I'd coordinated. A field man recognizes a field man. Doesn't need a long introduction, needs a first week. After that, credibility walks on its own. The first week was intense in a good way. That intensity of a new thing that demands the best of you without apologizing. Technical meetings, visits to partner operators, analysis of ongoing contracts, equipment evaluation. I slept tired and woke up before the alarm, which is the most honest sign the body gives that it's in the right place. In the third month, the branch closed its first direct contract with an operator from the Santos Basin. Predictive inspection service on 4 rigs. For 2 years with a renewal clause. Dorival called when the signature was confirmed. He just said, "Your dad would be proud." I went a second without speaking. Then I said, "Of you too." He gave a short laugh, that laugh of a man who doesn't laugh for no reason, and hung up. Fabio from Sarah found out through the Rig Buddies WhatsApp network. He sent me a 4-minute audio. I listened to twice. Complained I hadn't let him know earlier. Said I should have called him to work at the branch. Said Sarah had the best maintenance technician Santos never saw. Said he was going to charge me a picanha steak when I went to Fortaleza. At the end of the audio, after all the act, he said in a lower voice, "I'm glad, Marcos, truly." Nilsson sent a text message. 6 words, I knew it would work out. Nilsson from Bulem never wasted a word. In the following months, the branch grew. Not explosively, not that startup growth that hits headlines and vanishes in 2 years. It grew in the solid way of those who build a foundation before putting up walls. Second contract, third partnership, the team growing carefully, reputation being built in the sector with the kind of consistency that takes time to appear, but when it does, doesn't vanish easily. At the end of the first year, the share I had in the branch was worth more than everything I'd accumulated in the previous 15 years combined. I don't tell you this to talk about money. I say it because there's a lesson there that took an accident, a hospital in Makey, a bathroom floor, and a woman who called me a burden for me to truly learn. Value isn't what you produce every month. Value is what you accumulated over the years that nobody saw being built. It's the knowledge, the network, the reputation, the capability. That doesn't show up on the bank transfer on the 5th. It shows up when someone who truly sees knocks on your door and says, "I need you." She never saw it because she never looked. She spent 6 years staring at the bank statement and thinking she'd seen the whole man. I let that happen for too long because I confused presence with care and salary with value. I learned late, but I learned. Today I live in an apartment in Santos with a window facing the port, a different view from the Florianopolis one. It doesn't have the same postcard beauty. It doesn't have that clean shore and open sky. It has cranes, ships, movement, work. It has the noise of things being built and moved and transformed. I wake up every day and look out that window and think it's exactly the view I needed. I never saw Mr. Agenor from the bakery again, but I think of him sometimes, of that uncharged cheese bread, of the way he changed the subject to figurance, without letting me sink into silence. A small gesture from a big man. The world is full of people who talk a lot about care and do little, and full of people who say nothing and show up with a free-range chicken lunchbox when you're on the ground. Learn to distinguish the two before building your life around someone. Cause a rig warns you before it gives way. A person warns you too. It's us who insist on not listening. I listened late, but I listened. And sometimes late is the right time. If this story touched something you carry, comment down below. It could be a word, could be a paragraph, could be just a period.